Hello. Today I want to talk to you. Let me just put it right up on the screen quickly here. Uh, Come on, get up there. There we go. Um, Put that up. Come on. There it is. Virtue epistemology. A movement for our times, I say. I'm recording this in the spring semester of 2021. 4 years ago, in the spring semester of 2017, I also taught this epistemology seminar. I teach it once every 2 years, and that was, of course, was the first semester after Donald Trump became the president. And so I'd heard about virtue epistemology, and we did look into it in that class, the one 4 years ago. And in fact, we came up with a paper. I don't think it was successful. I didn't submit it, but but I'll give you a link to it. I'll give you a link to the to my philosophy blog where you can read it. So virtue epistemology, I mean, I say a movement for our times. Virtue epistemology is not going to turn out to be a really tight set of theses or a real tight school. It's not going to turn out to, we are going to talk a little bit about methodology or the way that it's aiming at producing some knowledge. But it's a movement. It's a movement that, quite apart from the sort of some of the philosophical aspects of that we're going to look at today, it's a part of a much broader movement that we really need to have about sort of epistemic and intellectual integrity and really valuing the truth. And I want to get into some of those philosophical issues today. So it's timely, I guess, is the message. All right, so sources of virtue epistemology. Now, not wanting to talk about ethical theory too much, although there's no way to get around that. It's coming to some extent out of ethical theory, where you have sort of rationalist ethical theory, which is about rights, and that's Kant, and it says that you have to universalize your maxim. You have to put yourself in the position of a generic rational person. And there's empiricist ethical theory that's non-cognitive. That is, it doesn't think that ethical thinking is a kind of logical thinking. People like David Hume think rather that there are sort of moral sentiments that are not necessarily rational, although he suspects they do have naturalistic ideologies or explanations. So anyway, since about the middle of the 20th century, there's been a good development in ethical theory of a third way, which is virtue ethics, which comes out of the ancient Greek attitude towards ethics, and particularly Aristotle in his writings. So developing a third kind of way. And what is virtue theory? Well, virtue theory is judging the whole person. So here's one way of looking at what's going on with virtue theoretical ethics. The rationalist, like Kant, makes a judgment about the motives, about the reasoning behind the act. The empiricist, like Hume or Mill, makes a judgment about the consequences of the act. And Aristotle then makes a judgment, the Greek makes a judgment about the person, about the quality of the person, whether the person is good or bad, not whether the motive is good or bad, or whether the act itself was good or bad in its effects, but rather the goodness or badness of the person in as much as their actions reflect their qualities, which is rough. The ancient Greeks, that's a rough ethics there, best judgment on the person. But anyway, so you can see then this has been a successful unfolding in ethical theory. So then the natural question is, well, what about epistemology? Now it's sort of turning back on itself, of course, because we get rights theory from rationalist epistemology, and we get consequentialist theory from empiricist epistemology. So, but the issue there is, well, can we get some other kind of epistemology? Can we talk about the virtues that a person has? And one issue, of course, is going to come up is epistemic versus ethical, which I think is going to be tricky. And as I say in the last point there on the slide, that's all very epistemic, esoteric. I do want to talk about that third bullet point there about social epistemology. Another thing about the 20th century is very much involved all kinds of philosophers on both sides of the Atlantic, as I say, and all the rest of that, very much involved in social critique, the Frankfurt School, the late phase Marxist people were very into what we might call social epistemology. That is, and then you also have sociologists of science and people like that. So looking at things as being socially constructed, sociology around the end of the 1940s, 1950s was very much about the social construction of reality, if you will. And so then virtue epistemology also sort of following, social epistemology, I'm sorry, also following from that. Social epistemology really putting emphasis on the sort of socially constructed nature and the social nature of knowledge, the social conditions of knowledge, which is maybe a more subtle question. All right. So what about virtue epistemology? If we know what virtue ethics is, we know what social epistemology is, then the question is, what's virtue epistemology? Virtue ethics says, well, what we're doing is making a judgment about the qualities that the person has, such that they're conducive to their acting ethically. And so virtue epistemology is going to be the study of the qualities that the person has, such that possession of those qualities is conducive to knowing, whatever that is, right? Okay. I think, and I don't mean to be too snarky about it on that second bullet point there, but there's a distinction between the reliabilist and the responsibilist. I do have to say, I think that's a little bit a creature of the distinction is a bit of a creature of the journal article culture where everyone's running to write all these articles about it. So they have to say something that's kind of chaffy, I think, a little bit there. But the idea then is that as Aristotle would do both reliabilism and responsibilism. What are they? What's the difference? The reliabilist is looking, as they say there, I'd say sensory and cognitive virtues, things like acuity of vision and hearing and all of the sensory modalities, as well as things like memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, pattern recognition, that kind of stuff. So really learning psychology, perceptual and learning psychology, cognitive psychology, um, learning strings of numbers, that kind of stuff. Pretty rootsy stuff, and not real conceptually deep stuff. The responsibilists are analyzing character concepts that we have that denote what we think of as good character, honesty, diligence, that sort of thing. That is character traits that are going to be conducive to being a good knower. So I mean, reliabilism is sort of interesting in as much as clearly what's called for here is the interdisciplinary discipline that reaches into perceptual psychology and cognitive science. And it's possible that a good enough writer in virtue epistemology might be able to write something that was of interest to those people as well. Responsibilists, what we have had in virtue ethics, an outgrowth of virtue ethics, are a number of very nice books analyzing virtue theoretical concepts, kindness, generosity, maybe some negative ones, I don't know, jealousy. Books that is about emotion, because also a lot of this is going to have to be about emotion. I think that's something that's interesting about virtue epistemology, because emotional responses to things are definitely an important variable. But anyway, it looks like responsibilists might be able to do that kind of analysis of epistemic virtues. We've seen some successes, some interesting books about ethical virtues. So as I say, Aristotle's really mostly a biologist. And Aristotle's interested in the traits of a natural kind, a representative of a species, a member of a kind. And of course, Aristotle's teleological. What does that mean? That means he's talking about a sort of forward causation where this organism is meant to live a certain life cycle, is meant to achieve certain stages of growth. And so that's what it's sort of aiming for. Teleology, like a functionalist idea, really the cause of the thing lies in the future in a sense. Now, but Aristotle, again, bringing that to biology, and he's very much got a biological view of human beings. And so I think a good thing about Aristotle, a good thing about the Greeks in general, is they have what I call an organic social theory. So that is, they think that they just take human beings as parts of nature, like wolf packs or herds of animals or whatever, pods of whales, and there's human groups. And so they just sort of assume a kind of social context for human beings that other kinds of later social theorists, early modern social theorists are, I think, clunkier with that. Aristotle just, after all, thinks he's just studying the nature of human beings. Of course, a criticism of Aristotle is that that's very hidebound, right? So anyway, um, what are you going to get? I mean, what is virtue epistemology aiming at? What kind of knowledge is something like this going to produce? I think virtue epistemology, if it's going to be worth anything, Aristotle, I think, would think that it meant that you were going to generate some kind of discipline or practice in religious studies. Call that soteriological. That is, so you're studying the topic in order to transform, in order to change, in order to become more epistemically fit. Now, I mentioned that I wasn't sure about the philosophical interests of the reliabilists, but after all, but Aristotle doesn't make these distinctions. And Aristotle is going to say things like, well, yeah, to the extent that you have responsibility to good knower, then, you should play some memory games to improve your memory. And maybe you could do some, I don't know, eye exercises to increase your vision, take some vitamins so you can see better in the dark. I mean, these are kind of prescriptions of a sort of quasi-moral kind, in as much as the Greek sees, quote, morality, unquote, as sort of pursuing or trying to maximize one's virtues. Um, so we get, you're right. So we get this distinction between the reliabilists and the responsibilists. We already talked about that. Okay, fine. Right. And we talked about that as well, right? Developing a third way. Yeah, we're going the opposite direction. No wonder. We're going the opposite direction. All right. So that's where we were. Okay. Never mind. I'm a trained professional. Yeah. I'm exactly the person you want to have explain knowledge to you. All right. Social epistemology and virtue epistemology. Let's go into that a little bit more. The structure of scientific revolutions in 1962 is a bit of a landmark. You might want to note that if you're interested in this kind of thing. Sociology of science, philosophy of science, where what Kuhn says basically is you have stable periods, but they're punctuated by these paradigm shifting revolutionary periods. And so just basically raising questions for this notion of a kind of continuous evolution of science, and saying there's a kind of punctuated equilibrium of science. So, but in any event, this made a big stir, and then you get a lot more sociology and study of science. Now, the thing about social epistemology, though, social epistemology has a strong sort of critical side to it, but also that second point there on the slide, the social epistemology really doesn't mind all different kinds of sort of epistemic views. In fact, social epistemology definitely pushes against foundationalism, because social epistemology really emphasizes a kind of equilibrium, a kind of democratic equilibrium in a community. It definitely emphasizes the communal legitimation function. It's the community that legitimates knowledge. So, so even if you said, you could be a social epistemologist, and many social epistemologists might just say that, as far as they're concerned, all knowledge is really a social construction. Really. And I don't think virtue epistemology is really going to be able to sustain a claim like that, because I don't think it's really very well grounded. It looks like political variables are variables that need to be controlled. And I think, look, I mean, there are experimentalists, like people who do philosophy of physics and actual physicists and people like that, who object to some philosophical activity, and they say, well, who are these people who are trying to pick apart, our paradigms? What we're doing is setting up experiments and trying to measure things exactly and that sort of thing. But I would appeal to the experimentalist who is feeling impatient about social epistemology and say, look, isn't it true though that this might be a variable, and aren't you in the business of controlling variables? And, so anyway, virtue epistemology then wanting to be in some way ethically neutral, okay, or at least focusing not on what we typically take to be moral virtue, ethical virtues, but rather epistemic virtues, epistemic character virtues. I'm not sure. I mean, and you have to get at what motivates them. I mean, it can't actually be that the epistemic virtues are entirely motivated entirely differently than the ethical virtues, because you're talking about where values come from. Right? This is a problem. See, in Aristotle, some environmental ethicists got interested in Aristotle. A lot got interested in Aristotle because it looked like Aristotle's teleology suggested that each individual organism, since it had a telos, if that was valuable, then that was a way to get first order value into natural things. In this case, biological organisms. They'd be valuable in themselves, have first order value, and not be valuable simply in terms of being valuable to someone else by virtue of the fact that they had a telos that they in their life were striving to fulfill. I don't think that works actually as an environmental ethics. It's trying to get again, a monistic and kind of environmental ethics. I don't think it works because I don't think you get any real emotional traction. I mean, I just don't think I don't think morality works that way. I don't think it's cognitivist, for one thing. But that was the idea. Now, so social epistemology, it seems to me, rather militates in the direction of relativism because of its communitarian precepts. Virtue epistemology, intuitively, when you think about virtue epistemology, is okay, what are the virtues that you should practice to be a good knower? And we can start to think about those. That's not what I'm trying to do here today, but the idea would be think about, again, caution, patience, prudence, diligence, thoroughness, that kind of stuff that you felt, things that would be motivated by a sense of responsibility to be a good knower, I think. Now, so here, the first bullet point on this slide, we could have a correspondence theory. That's intuitively the one we go to, especially if we're talking about virtue epistemology. I think, well, that's being really, really careful to get it just exactly right. But you could have a coherence theory of truth or an instrumentalist theory of truth, and you could certainly talk about the virtues, the epistemic virtues on that theory of truth. So there's certainly nothing that precludes doing virtue epistemology under sort of any kind of theory of truth that we can think of. Pragmatists could certainly study virtue epistemology and practice it. On the other hand, Aristotle himself would not have any truck with that. He would insist, as I said before, that he's talking about a sort of representative member of a set of beings who are members of a natural kind, and the members of that natural kind shared some set of virtues such that a well-fulfilled member of the kind would have those virtues. And he wouldn't think that that would vary any more than it would with, say, horses, right, or peach trees. And then the last, so there's a dilemma there on that last point. I'm really not sure where to come down with that, although I do sort of suspect that we already have an idea of what good knowers and bad knowers are. And so one of the things we want to do is investigative, as Aristotle would urge. We want to figure out, well, what is it exactly that we already think characterizes good knowers? Briefly here, there's a famous issue, 20th century issue in epistemology called the Gettier problem. I don't want to spend endless amounts of time on it, but just quickly, since ancient times, one standard theory of what we can say that we know something is when we have justified true belief. It's a true belief, it's correct, but also it's justified. What does that mean? That the way that I came to have the belief is the right kind of way. Perhaps, for example, that I saw it with my own eyes. That would be an example of what good justification. In this case, let's just say a trusted informant, that is a person, let's say, idealize, it's the most trusted informant I have. And typically if that person who's never steered me wrong before tells me something, and it's something that's true, that's a tricky part, then I maybe say to know it. But what Gettier showed in a short article that's become kind of legendary is that it's easy to construct counterexamples. This counterexample I'm using here is one I made up. In this case, let's say that my trusted informant is for the first time in our entire lives in all these 20 years we've been together, my trusted informant is actually trying to lie to me, but my trusted informant makes a mistake and accidentally tells me the truth. Okay. So notice I'm going to have exactly the same belief because she mistakenly told me the truth as I would if she had intentionally told me the truth. In both cases, I'm going to come to have the same belief. She would have said the same words. So why is that philosophically interesting for us? Because one question that comes up, it's not the question everybody's asking with Gettier problems, is what about knowledge for its own sake? I mean, granting that you might, like the color spectrum invert, never actually have any way of knowing that you've got that information in an improper way, through a broken causal chain, wouldn't you intuitively prefer to have one that you had gotten in the right kind of way, that had the right kind of causal ideology? And I have to say the results are mixed. They're mixed in my own mind, and they're mixed in the minds of people that I've talked to about this. I wanted that to be, I sort of thought, oh, maybe there's something there. And it will turn out that we can show that we value knowledge for its own sake. Knowledge has first order value. But I'm not really sure that that's true. That's what I was looking for. But I'm not sure that that's what that shows. So it's an interesting question. All right. So again, then sort of summing up here, Aristotle thinks that virtues are personal qualities. And Aristotle thinks that when we're making moral judgments, essentially X is a good person, Socrates is a good person, as distinct from judging Socrates' act or Socrates' intentions. So it's qualitative. Aristotle doesn't have the distinction between, say, a good knife and a good sports car, and a good person. That's what Nietzsche liked about it. Remember, Nietzsche thought that sort of, then after that, you got the Judeo-Christian kind of perversion of all of that, but that the noble Greek warrior thought a person was good when they were good, like a racehorse, or, was good. And, that's very interesting, but that's, again, what's going on there. So you think of virtue epistemology, and it has roots in ethical theory, as I showed you, because it's kind of inspired by virtue ethics, and then also in cognitive psychology. It's a place where there is an interesting overlap. So it ought to be a discipline. Now, as with environmental problems and others, sometimes I think we think that there needs to be sometimes people will say both positively and negatively about philosophy, oh, they're going to make like a whole new ethics. And then someone will say, I'm skeptical. I think we have good old ethics and good old epistemology, and we have changing times and changing challenges. But I'm not sure that our ethics and I'm a little bit on the foundationalist side. I'm not sure that our ethics and our epistemology are really that much up for negotiation. I'm not sure our values are that much up for negotiation or adaptation. I think what has to be is that we have to figure out a way to bring our values with us into a changing world and sustain them like that. So, all right, just a brief introduction to virtue epistemology, a movement that is still forming. Maybe it'll really get somewhere. I'm going to give you a big bibliography at the end of that paper that I'm going to link you to. So anyway, introduction to virtue epistemology, a work in progress, both in terms of my understanding of it, but I think as a movement, it's very much a work in progress too. All right, so I'll see you next week.